to another episode of Arbitration Life. I am Janette, Brin.
And I'm Hana Doumal.
So in the last year, we have seen remote hearings come to the forefront, including us here at the BVI International Arbitration Center, where a number of our clients have been booking remote hearings. So I was doing a bit of research, and I came across this 2020 American Bar Association Practice Points article titled, "Why You Should Consider Opting for Arbitration During the Coronavirus Pandemic." The article stated, before the pandemic, it was debatable whether arbitration was a preferred dispute resolution mechanism. Countless articles discuss how the traditional benefits of arbitration, speed and cost, may no longer hold true when parties in arbitration act like they are in litigation, filing dispositive motions, engaging in extensive discovery and depositions, and conducting trial-like hearings over multiple days or sometimes longer. So unbiasedly, of course, I agree with the writer's point on why parties should consider arbitration. But I'm curious to know, Hana, how debatable is this argument? And have you ever witnessed parties of an arbitration behaving like they're in litigation?
Absolutely, Janet. Actually, I have witnessed counsel, and there were US litigators also doing arbitration behaving exactly like that, objecting and behaving as if they were in a US court. So I do actually absolutely agree with you that parties should always consider arbitration. However, I think that the first point that was made in the article you mentioned, and the fact that it is debatable whether arbitration was the most preferred dispute resolution mechanism before the pandemic. I think this is a view that is very specific to the US. And having studied there, I can say that it's not the most pro-arbitration jurisdiction. And it is, and we all know that. We all know it's very litigation oriented still. However, outside of the US, I would say that on the contrary, arbitration has always been and remains the preferred dispute resolution mechanism in international commerce, and that even before the pandemic. And one of the greatest advantages of arbitration is precisely that it is international, because it uses and actually embraces practices of the best of what common law and civil law have to offer in terms of procedure. And it combines them for a middle ground to emerge, allowing the parties to engage in reasonable discovery. You mentioned that earlier. So not something extensive US court style discovery, but something that is reasonable. And actually the IBA rules on the taking of evidence in international commercial arbitration are the perfect example of combination and compromise between the civil and the common law systems. And yes, okay, so this is a very interesting topic and I could go on with it, but we are interested in what you have to say, members of the arbitration community. So please don't hesitate to leave some comment below or on our social media at Arbitration Life. We may have to actually ask today's guest on his thoughts. And Janette, could you please tell us more about today's guest?
Today's guest is a rather distinguished gentleman with over 40 years of experience in the field of arbitration. In June 2016, he was appointed CBE Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the Queen's Birthday Honors list for services to international arbitration. An occasional lecturer who is always in high demand at industry conferences around the globe. He has served as chairman, party-appointed arbitrator, or sole arbitrator on international arbitral tribunals in both ad hoc and institutional arbitrations under the rules of pretty much all major arbitral institutions. He's the chairman of the BVI International Arbitration Center, and we are so honored to have him join us here today on Arbitration Life.
Please welcome Mr. John Beechey.
Well, first off, welcome to Arbitration Life.
Welcome, John.
Your career started in 1977 at Clifford Turner, where you later became a partner and founding partner of the firm's international arbitration practice. What was it that first attracted you to the practice of arbitration and ultimately the idea to introduce arbitration to the firm's practice?
Well, first of all, I have to confess that 1977 is doing me a favor. I actually started in 1975.
Wow, nice.
But the immediate answer to your question is that almost as soon as I walked into the door of the firm, I was then regarded as a rather exotic animal because I spoke a language other than English. And I spent the first couple of years of my career roaming around parts of Central and Eastern Africa. And then, having got a taste for international work, decided that a career as a domestic litigation lawyer was not what I wanted to do. And the other big obstacle to progress, as far as I could see, was that unless in those days one was a member of the bar, then there were very few opportunities to practice as an advocate. There'd be what were called master's summons in the High Court, and on a high day and Friday, there would be applications to the commercial court judge, but that was about it. And it seemed to me that there were better ways of doing things than observing all the rituals that go with the English bar's practice in those days. So the only way to become an advocate effectively was to develop a practice in international arbitration where these peculiar restrictions didn't apply. And that started in 1978, and I started the practice when I became a partner in Clifford Chance, at Clifford Turner as it still was, in 1983. And it went from there.
Excellent.
Wow, okay. And John, as one of the best known and certainly most highly respected arbitrators in the world, what do you think makes an arbitrator a good one?
I think it's like everything else. It's a combination of things, and there's an awful lot of paddling very fast under the water to make things look as though they're going smoothly on the top. But the key thing is to get to a point where the parties may agree or disagree with you, but they have some confidence that the proceedings are going to be well run, that they're going to be heard, and that the rulings are fair. And when it comes to an award, as has often been said, and I'm certainly not the first to say it, what really matters is that the party that loses should understand why it has lost.
Yes, absolutely.
So what would you say was a moment of failure that taught you the most in your career?
I've given quite a lot of thought to that because it's not the usual fast ball that comes down the track. But the brutally honest answer was the destruction of the practice that I built in the United States, which I'm immodest to say at one point would have left Clifford Chance with probably the finest practice in North America had it been allowed to stay together. And the proof of the pudding is that its members are now star players in their own right in a number of leading firms in the city of New York and indeed elsewhere. That was a base political decision by one member of the then leadership of the American litigation practice, who within 6 months or so of scorching earth behind him went off to run another practice. And frankly, good luck to him and good luck to them. But I regard that loss as probably the greatest failure of my career.
Okay, well, thank you, John. Thank you
Yeah.
for keeping it real. This is what we're trying to do at Arbitration Life. Now, another question for you. Who is an arbitrator that you admire and why?
I'm not going to name any one, and there's a reason for that. And it's apart from that, it's simply invidious. There's a number. And they range from arbitrators before whom it's been a privilege to appear, arbitrators with whom it's been a privilege to sit, and indeed in any other context other than international arbitration, I would never have been given that opportunity. The key to me is that with very, very few exceptions, those with whom I've worked have been people whom I've come to like, and a number of them become friends, and indeed, in many cases, friends of many years standing. So one of the things that attracted me to this field of practice was that it was spared some of the sort of petty bickering that occurs in many other fields of law. And it is generally an international group of not necessarily like-minded people, but people who are immensely interesting, immensely interested, and who have very much the determination to provide a degree of justice in a private sense, which at the moment is being maligned by certain politicians and certain institutions, not least the European Commission, because they seem to think that you're not safe if you let loose as private individuals on matters that go to the interests of states. But that's another story. But it's a long way from your initial question, but the short answer is there's many, and there are quite a few to whom I owe an enormous amount.
Good to know.
Yes. So I don't think a lot of people could say this, but, and I hope I have the year right, June 2016, you were appointed CBE, Commander of the Order of the British Empire. What was that experience like, and what does it mean to you to be recognized in such a manner?
Well, the experience wasn't really in June 2016. The experience came on a very chilly day in January 2017, when, as apparently is his idiosyncratic habit, the Prince of Wales had ordained that the windows of Buckingham Palace should be kept open for the investiture, so most of us froze whilst he was in his full uniform. But the recognition mattered because, as I discovered afterwards, the nomination was the result of a lot of work by arbitration and legal practitioners, not just in London, but internationally, who had a London link. And that mattered a lot. And it mattered, frankly, all the more because I'd just done 6 years effectively restoring a somewhat broken institution in Paris. And needless to say, the French weren't too keen about having a Brit do that for them. So there was no recognition whatever in France. It was nice to get some in Britain.
And now, John, let's not say what the French did. Yeah, unfortunately, French people sometimes
I couldn't help but
do not recognize, and I can say this because I'm French. So fair point, I totally get it. Now, John, so you participated in the groundbreaking IBA working group, responsible for the rules on the checking of evidence in international commercial arbitration. So I mentioned those rules earlier, and you also worked on the conflict of interest guidelines. How was this experience, and why do you think it's so groundbreaking?
Well, it was groundbreaking because it simply hadn't been done before. And the IBA was conscious, as indeed many people were in practice around the world, that there was the beginnings of a sort of harmonization of what was to become a form of international arbitration best practice. And remember, in 1999, when the rules on taking of evidence were beginning to be developed, there were still some pretty clear divisions between the common law and the civil law world. And this was a genuine attempt to bring together practitioners from the two, as it were, major parts of the divide, and see whether we could come together to come up with some rules which satisfied everybody, and all of us felt we could apply in our own practice. What I do note, and in light of what comes later on your question sheet, it's worth bearing in mind, is that in 1999, it was a group of men, albeit men from around the world and from the civil and common law jurisdictions. By 2010, when the first revision took place, there were 4 women in the group. By 2020, there were 10 out of 29. And the geographical spread of those involved in the exercise had genuinely become worldwide. So one could see not only an evolution of practice, one could see an evolution of the way in which those who were putting it together were being brought together. So it remains, in my view, a remarkable exercise, and one for which the IBA should be genuinely congratulated. It's made a huge impact. I'm not so sure that the rules on conflicts of interest were as warmly received, because there were some real differences in approach among members of the committee to start with. And again, this is what, 2004. Things have moved on an awful long way since then, but they are still applied. They're still points of reference, even if they're not applied. And I think one of their most significant contributions has been to rein in, or at least to alleviate, the worst effects of some of the more extreme versions of conflict rules or impositions that tend to be applied. I mean, if you want an example in how to go to an extreme, look at the Californian 27-page list of things you have to tick off as being matters which need to be satisfied before you can operate a clean conflicts bill. I exaggerate a bit, but not by very much. So both of them have been exercises which hadn't been undertaken before. I don't think any other organization but the IBA could have done it, actually. It wasn't really appropriate for an UNCITRAL working group. It needed real practitioners who had an interest in seeing that side of the profession develop, and that's what they did.
Okay, thank you.
So to a critic of arbitration, I should say, who would say that some parties in arbitration act as if they're in litigation, engaging in extensive discovery and depositions and conducting trial-like hearings and so on. What would you say to such a critic?
Well, this perhaps is why it comes back to being a decent arbitrator, because unless the parties have absolutely tied your hands with an agreed procedure, which is of such a nature that it's not possible to unpick it, then any arbitrator worth his or her salt is going to have a look at it and say, look, we don't do it this way. This is not what the rules under which you've agreed to resolve your dispute require, and we're going to do it the way the rules say. So to some extent, it requires not so much sort of dictating the pace, but quite often it requires guidance.
Yeah.
Because bear in mind, a lot of people come still to this game new, they've never done it before. And the instant fallback inevitably is to go back to what you're best used to. And that's generally the local litigation practice of the courts of your home jurisdiction. And sometimes it takes some education and it doesn't take very long before people get the idea, but it helps. And again, if you've got an genuinely international dispute, this sort of thing is less likely to arise. But if you find yourself classically in New York with two, whatever may be the international flavor, but essentially American companies engaged in a vicious dispute, and the attorneys are all US attorneys, and the tribunal comprises 3 US arbitrators, then you stand more of a chance of ending up with something which resembles more something in the US courts than you would do if you were dealing with a mixed international tribunal and mixed parties from different jurisdictions.
Agreed.
Absolutely.
That basically supports what Hana and I were talking about earlier about the same question. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for that.
And now, John, and we want to mention your role as chairman of the BVI International Arbitration Center. And we want to ask you, what would you say is very specific to the BVI ISC compared to other institutions?
Well, first of all, it's a real and not a virtual arbitration center in a part of the world where such things are not exactly commonplace. It has well-developed rules. It has exceptional premises, even if you can't talk to them by Zoom every now and again.
No, but everyone can see the lounge right now because we're in the lounge of the BVI ISC.
It has a dedicated professional leadership, and that's important. It has support from the local courts and the local executive, but quite properly, it is entirely independent, and that is something to be proud of. And I think it's a matter of time, but in that sense, it has, in my view, a real future. It has all the attributes and none of the downsides. And it's new, and it's determined to try to make a mark.
Absolutely. I believe the same.
Absolutely, absolutely. So a big thing at the center, of course, is diversity, and the issue of diversity and gender equality is often talked about. We have asked a number of our guests their take on it and would love to hear your thoughts on what does the industry need to do more of to tackle the issue of diversity and gender equality.
Well, the first thing I'll tell you is that I'm horrified to hear it referred to as an industry. I remember being told off roundly by Howard Holtzman when I dared to refer to it as a big business.
Okay.
So you've multiplied it dramatically by describing it as an industry. I think the key point, so far as I'm concerned, is that, well, let me back up a little bit.
Okay.
I do feel I can say this with some degree of authority because, so far as I know, I was the first partner in the firm wittingly to employ LBTG staff. And the only criterion, so far as I was ever concerned, in whom I recruited was, are they good and are they going to do the job and are they going to be loyal to the team? And they've fulfilled all of those criteria without any question whatever. When I got to the ICC, I discovered there wasn't a single woman among the vice presidents of the court, so 4 were appointed. My general line is that if somebody is good enough to do the job, I frankly don't care whether they're male, female, black, white, Oriental, Caucasian. I really don't care. I just want the job to be done and to be done very well. And if I have a concern, it's checkbox ticking, so that equality means 50-50 simply for the sake of having 50-50. Not necessarily because the quality represents 50-50. And quite honestly, if I have 10 candidates and 8 of them are men and there are 2 women, or there are 8 women and 2 men, I will choose out of the 10, the 4 or 5 I'm looking to hire without regard to whether they're male or female. I just want the best people to do the job. And as I say, I think what has struck me most is that if you look back at the women who were coming through towards the top of the profession as I was going up, there's a number of extraordinary characters there, and they've made a huge mark, and they've made it not by being noisy, but by being highly effective, highly impressive, and highly respected. And they've become role models for a whole generation, including, I may say, my daughter, who saw the way some of these people worked and decided she'd give it a go as well. But they didn't have it easy. And if you catch the likes of people like Wendy Miles, who's spoken at the BVIAC, she will tell you it was a tough, tough road. And I have immense respect for my colleagues who have done it and come out the other side and are still prepared to be smart about it, but they've had a heck of a ride on the way. And but it is moving. The reason I raised those numbers about the anecdote of the working group on the rules of taking your evidence is indicative of the way things have moved. This is a profession that will go out of its way now to make sure that we do have regard to proper candidates for the job. I'm looking at the moment to find a chair for an arbitration in a part of the world where it's not often that one finds a woman presiding over the tribunal. And I and my colleague, who would both be classed these days as pale, male, and stale, have come up with a list of 6 women. Wow. And one of them is bound to be chosen. There's no doubt about that. Definitely. So it's evolving, but I've always had this slight nagging fear at the back of my mind that if things are then done by rote, it spoils it.
Thank you. Thank you for your insight on that.
Absolutely. And now, John, if you had not become an arbitrator, an arbitration practitioner, later an arbitrator, what do you think would have been another career choice for you?
Well, I'll tell you the 2 I wouldn't have done. I wouldn't have become a teacher because, as anyone would tell you, I don't have the patience.
Okay.
I wouldn't have become a classical musician because I simply wasn't good enough to get past the early stages. So that was that out. and I'd have probably ended up being a journalist or, heaven help us, a politician, but perhaps not. That's a dark art if you want to go there. So basically, it comes back to going into the law and then seeing, well, what can I do with that, with the background as a modern linguist.
Okay, thank you.
So what does John Beechey CBE, one of the best known arbitrators in the world, do for fun? Do you binge watch TV shows? What do you do?
Well, it's only the pandemic that's caused a certain amount of binge watching. I've never done it before, but suddenly things like Call My Agent have become rather attractive, because I've never seen the French being treated in such a way by anybody. Only a French producer could possibly have produced that show.
Yes, Call My Agent. It's such a good show. I've seen it. 10% it's fully in French. It's really good.
It's very good indeed. And for me, it's an absolute hoot to see the French making fun of the French as only they can. It's brilliant. But in terms of, but the television is fortunately only a small part of it. These days, because of various restrictions, that my international horizons are this screen, and the real horizons are the boundaries of the village. So there's a daily walk. But what that does is remind me of some very good times indeed, with walks with particular colleagues of whom I've been very fond, or walks with my wife, places like Lake Saranac and Lake Louise, and then the Bondi Bronte walk in Australia, and then walks in Western Scotland and in Aberdeenshire, and closer to home along parts of the coast here. So walking is quite important. I have to confess to owning two 1960s classic cars, which occasionally come out of the garage and are seen on the road.
Old hobbies are back then. That's good. Your old hobbies are back.
And then I read omnivorously all sorts of things. I mean, there are certain authors whom I've read right through, but I think it's probably fair to say that P.G. Wodehouse I still regard as the finest comic writer in English. There are a couple of good books I've read recently whilst we've been in lockdown. One is a book about Leonard Cohen's Stow on Hydra by Polly Sampson called Theatre for Dreamers, which is interesting. And there's a riveting book which won the Goncourt some years back by Eric Vuillard called Order of the Day, which is unputdownable. But more recently, a chum of mine who was at university with me has produced an English translation of a work about of all things, the Peace of Saint-Germain, which marked a pause in the French wars of religion, called The Negotiator. And if you thought Donald Trump was the model for a negotiator, forget it. Try this guy. He really knew what he was talking about.
I'm worried. I'm worried you've done that.
And then apart from that, it's music, it's opera, it's Mozart particularly, a certain amount of jazz, and I will confess to a sneaking admiration for Buddy Holly and Dolly Parton.
Great.
Nice. That's where I'm prepared to go.
Dolly Parton fan too.
So there you go.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John, for making the time to speak with us today. And it's great to learn more about you and your fantastic career.
Yeah, thank you so much, John.
Sorry it took a while to join at the start.
No worries at all.
All righty.
Thank you so much, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Cheers. So that was awesome.
It certainly was. It was. And I really want to thank John again for making the time to speak to us today.
Yes. And you, the viewers, are welcome to share your thoughts on today's conversation, including your thoughts on the litigation debate topic raised earlier. We would love to hear from you.
And please be sure to subscribe to the BVI ISC YouTube channel and to follow us on all our social media channels at Arbitration Life.
Arbitration Life is sponsored by the British Virgin Islands International Arbitration Center, meeting the rapidly evolving dispute resolution needs of arbitration users worldwide. The BVI IAC is a neutral, impartial, efficient, and reliable dispute resolution institution and conference center located in the Caribbean, Latin America, and at the crossroads of the Americas. For more information, visit bviiac.org.